You're the second person scheduled to speak in an important meeting. You've been explaining your proposal for about 30 seconds when someone interrupts you. It isn't aggressive. It isn't personal. They simply continue talking over you. And in that moment, you make a decision without even realizing you're making one. You give up the floor. You stop talking, wait for them to finish, and then continue from wherever they cut you off. That decision, made in less than 3 seconds, tells everyone in the room something about your place in the team's informal hierarchy. Chances are, you have no idea what that message was, but by the time that interruption happened, you had already sent a long series of signals, starting from the exact moment you walked into the room. Today, we're going to look at every one of them, the order in which people process them, and what you can change before the next meeting already sitting on your calendar. Something starts happening before you ever say your first word, and most people don't realize it's happening at all. The moment you walk into a room where someone with authority is present, that person has already started deciding who you are. Not consciously, not deliberately. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. The first impression someone forms becomes the filter through which they interpret everything that comes afterward. If that first impression is positive, they'll listen to your arguments more carefully. If it begins with signals of uncertainty, they'll unconsciously start looking for evidence that confirms that impression, even if your arguments are perfectly solid. In professional environments, fixing a bad first impression costs several times more effort than creating the right one from the start. Imagine two people walking into the exact same meeting. The first arrives after the leader is already seated, takes the first available chair, and is still searching for the right file when the meeting begins. The second arrives 3 minutes early, chooses a seat inside the natural line of sight of the person running the meeting, and has their materials open and ready before the leader even walks in. Neither person has spoken, neither person has contributed anything, and yet the room already sees them differently. The first person entered as another piece of information the leader processed upon arrival. The second was already part of the environment the leader was reading while walking into the room. That difference comes from three signals being processed simultaneously before anyone opens their mouth. When you arrive, where you sit, and whether you arrived prepared, or whether you're still in the process of arriving. The meeting hasn't even started yet. Someone is still trying to connect the projector. The boss is checking something on their phone, and in that silence before the conversation begins, your body is already speaking for you. There are two positions the human brain reads almost automatically in a meeting room. The first, leaning back in the chair, body slightly reclined, arms crossed or hands hidden below the table, small restless movements, adjusting position every couple of minutes. That reads as discomfort, as uncertainty, as someone who isn't entirely sure they belong in the conversation taking place around them. The second, leaning slightly forward, hands visible on the table, still, attention directed toward the person speaking or toward the focal point of the room. That reads as presence, as someone who knows they have something to contribute and is simply waiting for the right moment to do it. The difference between those two positions isn't performance. It isn't body language tricks. It's the external expression of two completely different mental states. The body of someone still deciding whether they deserve to be there versus the body of someone who already decided they do and is now focused on understanding what happens next. You don't need to force a posture. You need to make a decision before entering the room that you have something worth contributing. The body tends to follow that decision automatically. A variation of this happens when someone says something you disagree with before you've had a chance to speak. A number that's wrong. A statement that should probably be challenged. A direction that instinctively feels incorrect. Most people react physically before they react verbally. The body leans back. The arms cross. The jaw tightens. That tiny movement has already communicated something before you've even decided whether you're going to say anything. The person who keeps their posture stable under pressure, who processes information without physically reacting as though they had just been hit by it, projects a kind of confidence the room notices immediately. Not the confidence of someone who doesn't care what they heard, the confidence of someone who already knows exactly how they're going to respond. The meeting starts. The first person speaks and walks everyone through the agenda. The second voice belongs to a colleague. Then a brief silence appears. And this is where the difference emerges between the person who positions themselves well and the person waiting to be invited into the conversation. The person who waits to be asked communicates something very specific, that their participation is reactive rather than initiated, that they're there to answer questions, not to shape the discussion. It's the same pattern that keeps people executing tasks instead of making decisions, waiting for the system to call on them rather than operating from within it. The people who project presence speak before they're asked. They don't improvise. Before they ever walked into the room, they already prepared an observation or a question that adds something to the discussion. Think about the difference between these two opening contributions in the exact same meeting. The first, how much budget do we have available for this project? The second, this approach could create a conflict with the operations schedule. I'm bringing it up now to see whether it makes sense to adjust the approach before we move any further. The first requests information. The second contributes perspective. The first says you came to listen. The second says you arrived having already thought about the problem. During the first 60 seconds after you open your mouth, that distinction is exactly what the most senior person in the room is evaluating. The difference between a question that adds perspective and one that simply asks for information begins before the meeting ever starts. It requires approaching the topic with one question in mind. What is everyone else probably not going to mention? Not the obvious issue, not the point anyone could raise after reading the summary. The angle you're looking for is the one that appears when you connect the current discussion to another context, another project, another conversation you've had somewhere else. That connection is what turns a question into evidence of strategic thinking. And preparing it doesn't take hours. It takes the 15 minutes before the meeting that most people spend answering emails. And now we arrive at the moment we started with. The one that reveals more about your position than everything that came before it. You're speaking. Someone interrupts you. You have less than 3 seconds to decide what you're going to do. There are 3 possible responses, and each communicates something completely different. The first is to give up the floor. Stop talking, wait for the interruption to end, and then try to recover your point if you can. That doesn't read as kindness. It doesn't read as politeness. It reads as someone surrendering their claim to the floor, as someone who isn't certain enough of their right to occupy that space to hold on to it. The second option is to ignore the interruption and continue speaking over the other person. That creates unnecessary tension and is usually interpreted as aggression without social intelligence. In environments where hierarchy matters, that kind of response often generates costs that don't show up until after the meeting ends. The third response is the one that works, and it's the one very few people know how to use. When someone interrupts you, you pause briefly, allow them to say what they need to say, and the moment they finish, you reconnect the conversation back to your point. Something as simple as, "What you just mentioned connects directly to the point I was making." Then you continue exactly where you left off. That response accomplishes 3 things simultaneously. It acknowledges the interruption without competing with it, demonstrates that you never lost your train of thought, and reestablishes your presence in the conversation without creating conflict. The person with the most authority in the room notices that. Not always consciously. What happens after that moment is just as important as the moment itself. When you calmly take the floor back after an interruption, the room recalibrates around you. The people who were quietly watching to see how you would react now have a new reference point. This person doesn't get rattled easily. That adjustment carries into everything you say afterward. Your arguments suddenly sound more solid. Your proposals encounter less friction. Not because the ideas changed, because the room's perception of the person presenting them changed. And once that shift happens, it rarely reverses before the meeting is over. So what changes before the next meeting on your calendar? None of this requires more time than you already have. Start with timing. Arrive before the most senior person in the room. 3 to 5 minutes is enough. Being seated, settled, and visibly prepared when that person walks in changes the dynamic before you've said a single word. From there, choose your seat intentionally. Don't sit wherever space happens to be available. Sit where decision makers can see you naturally, beside them, across from them, or somewhere inside their direct field of view. Before you walk in, prepare one contribution. Not a speech, not a presentation, one observation or one question that reveals you've already spent time thinking about the issue beforehand, something only someone who reviewed the topic before the meeting would think to raise. Deliver it within the first 3 minutes, instead of waiting to be called on. And before entering the room, make one final decision as well. Decide in advance what you're going to do when someone interrupts you. Because eventually someone will. If the answer is already prepared, you won't hand the decision over to the autopilot response that almost always gives way. You'll pause, you'll let them finish, and then you'll continue with, "What you just said connects directly to the point I was making." A sentence decided before entering the room completely changes what the room remembers about you. The person we started this video with, the one who gave up the floor when they were interrupted, didn't do it because they lacked an argument. They did it because they had never decided in advance what they would do in that moment. The autopilot made the decision for them. The next time you find yourself in that same situation, the decision is already made. You pause. You let them finish, and then you continue exactly where you left off. The meeting doesn't start when someone says, "Let's begin." It starts the moment you walk into the room, and it ends when the last person watches you walk out. What's left is deciding what they're going to see. Meetings are one of the places where those perceptions get built. But there's another moment in your workday where that exact same system of evaluation is active, one that lasts somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes, and that almost everyone treats as though it doesn't matter. In reality, it carries far more weight than most people realize in how they're perceived by the people making decisions around them. That's what we'll look at in the next video.